We were all buzzing with excitement, barely able to sit still in our seats as the college van rolled out of the city limits. This was the trip we'd been planning for months, the perfect farewell to our final year. A group of 12, bound not just by classrooms and shared lectures, but by late-night study sessions, failed presentations, secret crushes, and memories we never wanted to forget. The idea of one last adventure before we were scattered across jobs, cities, and grown-up responsibilities felt poetic. And this place, this secluded hill station in the mountains, was meant to be our little escape from everything. No Wi-Fi, no teachers, no deadlines, just us and the wilderness. The ride was filled with noise and laughter. Someone passed around chips, someone else played DJ with a cracked phone and a Bluetooth speaker that kept disconnecting. We took selfies, shouted over the music, teased each other, and talked about everything we were going to do, hiking to waterfalls, staying up all night playing cards, cooking together, telling ghost stories just for the thrill of it. No one suspected that a ghost story might actually be waiting for us. Quietly, out in those woods, the road got narrower as we climbed higher. The asphalt gave way to gravel, and the houses became fewer and farther between. By the time we reached the last turnoff, the sun was already sinking behind the treetops, and a mist had started to crawl across the valley floor. Still, no one was worried. It only made everything feel more magical, like we were stepping into a postcard or a movie. The trees lining the road grew taller, thicker, their trunks wrapped in moss, their shadows long and heavy. Some of us started joking about wild animals or witches in the woods. Someone even said this looked like the kind of place people vanish in horror movies, and we all laughed. We finally pulled up at a faded wooden sign that simply said Forest Edge Retreat. It was old, with the paint peeling off, and a large pine branch hung over it like a curtain. A man was standing there, waiting. He looked like he could have been carved out of the trees, himself, skin like bark, eyes sunk deep into his weathered face, holding a lantern that flickered in the growing darkness. He didn't say much when we got out, just looked at each of us slowly, as if counting. Then he turned and began walking into the trees. We followed. The path he led us down wasn't paved, just dirt and roots and fallen pine needles. The air was cold now, colder than we expected, and every sound of a twig, the rustle of the underbrush, cawed unnaturally loud. Nobody was talking anymore. We were all too busy looking around, trying to take it all in. The sky above had turned a deep purple, and the trees had closed in on both sides like a tunnel. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to swallow us. When we finally saw the cabins, there was a collective sigh of relief. 3 wooden structures, aged but intact, stood in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees. They looked older than any of us had imagined, weather-beaten and grey, with crooked porches and shutters that creaked in the wind. But they were dry, they had roofs, and they were ours for the next few nights. The guide handed us a set of rusty keys and mumbled something none of us caught, clearly before disappearing back down the path. We were too caught up in choosing rooms and dragging in our bags to notice how eerily quiet it had gotten. No more bird calls, no insects, no wind, just the occasional thud of footsteps on wooden floorboards and the distant crackle of a small fire someone was starting outside. Most of us brushed off the strange atmosphere as part of the wilderness charm. After all, that's what we came here for, to disconnect, to be surrounded by nature, to escape. The deeper silence, the heavy air, the odd way the forest seemed. to breathe with us. It was all just part of the setting, or so we thought. The guide stood by the path, waiting silently as we gathered our backpacks and sleeping bags from the van. He looked like he had belonged to the forest his whole life, with deep-set eyes that seemed to watch not just us, but something behind. You were something we couldn't see. His clothes were worn and stained with pine resin, and he held an old lantern that burned with a weak orange flame. Nobody asked him questions. There was something about his presence that made all our usual jokes and chatter feel out of place, almost disrespectful. Even the loudest among us fell quiet. He didn't smile. He didn't even introduce himself. He simply turned around and started walking into the woods. We followed, like children being led by a strict old relative, the sound of our footsteps. Crunching dead leaves, the only thing breaking the stillness around us. The dirt path was narrow, almost overgrown in some places, winding between gnarled trees that leaned over us like bent figures whispering secrets to each other. The sky had gone dark now, and the forest had swallowed most of the light. The guide's lantern barely lit the space in front of him, casting long, distorted shadows that slithered over the undergrowth and tree trunks. We whispered among ourselves. At first, half-hearted jokes about the Blair Witch, about how the guide looked like a horror movie extra, about how this place gave us real haunted vibes, but the jokes didn't stick. The further we walked, the more our voices felt unwelcome. The air grew colder, damper, heavier. There was a scent to it that none of us could place something earthy, like old wood, damp stone, and faintly, something metallic. Even the forest floor felt strange under our feet, like it didn't want us there. About 20 minutes in, the guide suddenly stopped. He turned to face us, his lantern held just low enough that the light hit the bottom of his face, making his eyes look like dark holes. He raised his hand slowly and motioned for us to come closer. We gathered around, unsure what he was about to say. "Stay together," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No wandering at night, no walking past the boundary trees, and if you hear someone calling your name, don't answer." There was a long pause. No one laughed. He didn't explain what he meant or elaborate on what boundary trees were. He just looked at each of us in turn, his eyes lingering longer on some of us than others. Then, without waiting for questions, he turned around and kept walking. We looked at each other, half expecting someone to break the tension with a joke, but no one did. We followed in silence. It was only another 10 minutes before we reached the cabins, and though we were relieved to finally arrive, that strange, quiet heaviness didn't go away. The 3 wooden cabins were arranged in a triangular formation around a dying fire pit, as if someone had once meant this place to be welcoming. But the windows were dark, the wood warped from years of rain and wind. Moss grew on the roofs. A rusty axe lay buried in a stump near one of the porches. The trees surrounding the clearing were so tall and thick that they blocked out what little moonlight remained. We couldn't even see the stars. The guide handed us the keys without a word, nodded once, and turned back down the trail. We watched him disappear into the forest, the orange glow of his lantern slowly swallowed by the trees. For a moment, none of us moved. Then someone forced a laugh, made a comment about the creepy old guy, and the spell broke enough for us to start claiming our sleeping spaces. But the silence of the forest pressed in on us. It wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. The night started off the way any first night on a trip should. We gathered around the small fire pit in the middle of the 3 cabins, wrapped in sweaters and jackets, hands clutching mugs of instant coffee and packets of chips. Someone brought out a portable speaker, playing soft music, while others lit scented candles inside the cabins to make things feel a little cozier. The chill in the air was sharp but manageable. The fire gave us warmth, and the company kept spirits high. We took turns telling funny stories, complaining about professors, and reminiscing about embarrassing college moments. For a while, it felt exactly like what we had hoped for, peaceful, far from the noise of the city, surrounded by friends and thick trees under a sky we couldn't even see. Around midnight, people started yawning. One by one, they peeled off, toward their cabins. A few of us stayed back, reluctant to let the night end just yet. Eventually, the fire burned low, and even the most stubborn among us gave up. I remember looking at my phone, 1:48 a.m. I shoved it in my pocket, brushed the ashes off my jeans, and walked to the cabin I was sharing with 3 others. It was cold inside, the walls creaking as if adjusting to the night. We set up our sleeping bags, joked about snoring, and finally drifted off. It couldn't have been more than half an hour later, when the scream ripped through the stillness. We all sat up at once. It wasn't a startled yelp or a startled cry, it was a full scream. Long, terrified, echoing through the trees with such intensity it felt like it shook the cabin walls. For a second, we all froze, unsure if we had really heard it or just dreamed it. Then someone from the next room shouted, "Did you guys hear that?" And all hesitation vanished. We grabbed flashlights and stumbled outside. The girls' cabin door was already open. 2 of them were standing just outside, barefoot, pale, trembling. One of them, Molio, was crying, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't even hold her phone straight. The other girls looked scared but unharmed. We rushed over, asking what happened, what was going on. "She saw something," one of them said. Outside the window, Aaliyah couldn't speak at first. She just kept staring at the edge of the forest, where the tree line stood like a black wall. Finally, she pointed toward the back of the cabin, her voice barely audible. "There was someone," she whispered, "right there, watching us." A couple of the guys immediately took off in the direction she had pointed, flashlights cutting through the dark. They circled the cabin, swept the edge of the trees, and even called out. But there was no answer, no movement, no sound except their own footsteps. "No footprints," one of them said when they returned. "The ground's soft. If someone was standing there, we'd see it." We tried to calm Alia down. She kept insisting she wasn't imagining it. She had seen a figure tall, unmoving, standing just beyond the window. She hadn't seen the face, just the shape. It didn't move, it didn't blink, it just watched. When she screamed and the other girls looked, it was already gone. Everyone tried to be rational. Maybe it was a shadow, maybe it was a tree, maybe her eyes played tricks on her in the dark. But something about the way she spoke, shaking, repeating the same words, not even blinking, made it hard to dismiss. She wasn't faking. She wasn't even the type to scare easily. And yet there she was, terrified. The morning after Alia's scream was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No one really talked about it over breakfast. People offered nervous smiles, weak jokes, and forced normalcy. But the energy had shifted. Even the usual sound of birds was absent, like the forest itself had gone mute. We packed our day with distractions, hiking up a short trail, playing volleyball in the clearing, cooking lunch together over a portable stove. But every now and then, eyes would drift toward the tree line, especially the patch of forest where Alia said she saw the figure. No one said it out loud, but all of us felt it, that weird weight in the air, like we were being watched. That night, we stayed in our cabins longer. The fire wasn't lit. The speaker remained off. People claimed they were tired, but no one really slept. Around 2:30 a.m., Daniel woke up with a sharp jolt. He didn't scream, but the sound of his bed shifting and the thump of his feet hitting the floor stirred the rest of us. When we turned on the light, we saw him hunched over, breathing heavily, pulling up his shirt. Red scratches 3 long. Deep marks ran down his back, angry and fresh. We all froze. "Did you fall or something?" someone asked. He shook his head. "I was asleep. I didn't even move. I woke up because I felt it burn." The marks weren't random. They were perfectly spaced, almost like claws. Nobody knew what to say. We examined the bed, the floor, the walls. Nothing sharp, nothing that could have caused it. He hadn't gotten up. The windows were still locked. The next day, Sumbul fainted during a walk. She was just ahead of us, laughing at something, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and collapsed onto the path. We rushed to her side. Her nose was bleeding, her skin cold. When she woke up, she looked around confused, like she didn't recognize any of us. We drove her back to the small village clinic, just past the forest's edge. The nurse took one look at her and called for the old village doctor. He examined her briefly, then looked at us. "You kids staying up in the cabins?" he asked. "When?" We nodded. He frowned deeply and shook his head. "That place is not meant to be disturbed. You shouldn't be there." We asked what he meant, but he wouldn't say. Just wrote down some basic medication and told us to take her home, not just back to the cabin. Home, away from the woods. That night, a few of us couldn't bring ourselves to sleep. We stayed up in the main cabin, sitting in a circle, whispering about what was going on. That's when the whispers began. At first, they were faint, so faint we thought we imagined them. But then they grew clearer, just outside the window. Whispering names. Our names. One by one. Aaliyah heard it first. Then Danielle. Then me. It wasn't just a sound. It was like the whisper was being pressed into our minds. Soft, careful, familiar. As if someone was standing right outside, calling to us in a voice we knew. I remember standing frozen, afraid to move, afraid to even blink. The flashlight I held felt useless, like no beam could cut through whatever was outside. We tried to look through the windows, but the glass had fogged over from the inside. And on one of them, just one, there was a single handprint, small, damp, on the outside of the glass. But when we opened the door, there was no one there. The air was still, cold, and completely silent. The decision to go to the lake was made impulsively, as if we were trying to shake off the thick, creeping dread that had settled over the cabins. We needed to feel normal again, to hear each other laugh without the weight of fear behind it. Someone mentioned the lake being nearby, just a short walk downhill through the trees, and how there might be cell signal there. The idea of connecting to the outside world, even briefly, felt like a lifeline. We were cut off from everything. No signal, no service, no GPS. It was beginning to feel like we were in a sealed pocket of the world that existed just outside of reality. 6 of us volunteered to go. The rest of us stayed behind, uneasy but too exhausted and shaken to walk through the woods at night. We watched them disappear into the tree line, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies before the darkness swallowed them. Someone tried to play music in the background to keep the mood light. It didn't help. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees sway with soft creaks and groans. Every sound felt amplified. Every second felt like it dragged a little longer than it should. An hour passed. Then too, the others hadn't returned. We tried to call their phones, but nothing went through. A few messages were sent, but none were delivered. The more time passed, the more anxious we became. We paced outside, peering into the dark, trying to listen for footsteps, voices, anything. One of the guys, Imran, insisted we wait a bit longer maybe. They'd gotten lost, maybe they were just taking their time. But something felt wrong. It was in the air. A pressure, like the forest was holding its breath. Around 5 a.m., just before dawn, we heard footsteps slow, dragging ones coming from the trees. We rushed out, and there they were. The 6 of them, walking in a line, no flashlights, no phones, just walking quietly, all with the same blank expression on their faces. They looked pale, their eyes glassy, clothes slightly damp. No one said anything, not a word. They walked past us, heading straight to their cabins like sleepwalkers. We tried asking what happened, if they were okay, why they took so long, if they'd gotten lost. No one responded, not even a nod. They moved like they didn't hear us, or like they weren't fully present. We followed them inside, trying to shake them out of it, but they lay down in their sleeping bags and curled up without a word. One of the girls, Ariba, kept staring at the ceiling with wide eyes, not blinking, not reacting to our voices. It was like something had been taken out of them. Later that morning, when the sun was fully up and the fog had lifted slightly, we tried again. One of the guys, Harris, finally looked at us. His voice was dry, cracked. He simply said, "Don't ask," and then rolled over to face the wall. None of them ate that day. None of them joined us outside. They just stayed in their cabins, unmoving, unresponsive. The rest of us felt powerless. We didn't know what to do. It was as if they had seen or heard something so incomprehensible it had shut down a part of their minds. Even the guide hadn't warned us about this. Whatever rules we thought we were following had clearly not been enough. Something in those woods had touched them, left its mark in a way we couldn't understand. And even though the rest of us hadn't gone with them, it felt like we were next. Like whatever had happened at the lake was now moving toward the rest of us, step by step, in the quiet between breaths. Asterisk. We left the cabins the next morning, not because we were ready to, but because we were afraid not to. The ones who had gone to the lake were still silent, moving slowly like their bodies were weighed down by something none of us could see. Their faces were blank, their eyes sunken, and they barely acknowledged us as we packed up. It took hours to get everyone ready. We had to physically guide some of them out, as if their minds had stopped recognizing where they were. The rest of us were running on anxiety and fear, desperate to be out of the forest and back to something familiar, something that made sense. The walk back to the main road was eerily silent. The trees that had once felt alive now stood cold and watching. There were no birds, no wind, no sounds of nature. Even the crunch of our footsteps on the path felt muffled. We kept looking back, half expecting to see something behind us, lurking, just beyond the tree line, but there was never anything there. And yet, the feeling of being followed never left us. Like the woods were alive and disappointed we were leaving. When we reached the van, we found the driver already waiting, staring at us with a look that said more than words ever could. He didn't ask questions. He didn't greet us. He simply got behind the wheel and started driving as soon as the doors were shut. The air inside the van was heavy with silence. No one spoke. No one played music. Even the hum of the engine seemed quieter than it should have been. We didn't talk about the lake. We didn't talk about the scratches or the whispers or the handprint. We didn't talk about the way the forest had seemed to close in around us that last night. Back at campus, things didn't go back to normal. The 6 who had walked to the lake never returned to their old selves. Harris dropped out of the semester. Without explanation, Ariba stopped responding to texts and disappeared from social media. Daniel, who had been scratched, started complaining of nightmares so vivid he couldn't tell if they were dreams or memories. He once showed up to class looking like he hadn't slept in days, eyes bloodshot, muttering something under his breath about voices in the trees. Within weeks, he was gone to Dot, one of the girls who had stayed behind. Marnua started having panic attacks at night. She said the dreams weren't hers, that she was seeing things she'd never witnessed. Standing by a lake at night, hearing her name whispered from behind her shoulder. I started waking up at exactly 3:03 a.m. every night, heart racing, drenched in sweat, with no memory of dreaming. Just that time. Every night. 3:03. Curiosity eventually led some of us to dig into the history of the cabins. What we found made our stomachs turn. Back in 1999, a group of travelers had gone missing in that same area. 5 friends, last seen, renting the same cabins. Their bodies were never found. Locals believed they were taken by the woods, claimed was the word one old article used. There were stories, urban legends, really about how the forest didn't like to be disturbed, that it watched, waited, and eventually decided who could leave and who couldn't. Most people chalked it up to myth, something villagers passed down to keep kids from wandering too far. But we had seen enough to know there was more to it than folklore. What unsettled us the most wasn't just what happened in those woods, it was how it followed us back, how the silence of the forest crept into our everyday lives, how shadows lingered a little longer in the corners of our rooms, how we could no longer trust the reflection in the mirror not to blink when we did.